So now we're doing, guys, what you call command economy. In a command economy, we know this that in a command economy, all the resources are owned by what you call government or the state, and the government decide the three economic questions of what, how, and for whom to produce. So key features of command economy is that the government is the owner of all these factors of production: land, labor, capital, enterprise, and therefore they are allocating these resources. What's the key motivation? The key motivation is, of course, to maximize the social welfare of the society, like individual welfare of the society. So in this, there is no private ownership. So there is no private ownership, and because there's no private ownership, there's no private interest. There's only social welfare maximization. Another thing that we need to know is that the decision making in this economic system is basically done by the government. So the key question of what, how, and for whom to produce is government's prerogative, the government's decision. Makes sense? How does the government take care of those decisions? And the answer is they do so through planning. So the government is the one that is planning. So you can understand the government will be really large in this economic system because they're deciding all the things about what, how, and for whom to produce. Make sense? So the government is the one deciding the allocation of resources. Um, there is no price mechanism. There is no demand and supply per se. The government is setting the prices. If there are prices, then the government is setting them. Number one. Number two is this that the government is also making sure that that resources are basically allocated through their planning. Okay. Any questions, guys, before we move on? So let's look at quickly the three economic questions and how the command economy is answering them. So one of the things that command economy is deciding is what to produce. Should they make more of capital goods or should they make more of consumer goods? So when you make more of capital goods, basically you know this that if you decide to make more of capital goods, you will be sacrificing. You will be sacrificing sort of current standard of living for future. But if you make more of consumer goods today, you might get more jam today or more consumer goods today, but tomorrow you might have lower resources. Isn't that true, guys? This is completely opposite of, yes, Bilal, this is completely opposite of the free market economy. So the government is planning the allocation of resources between current consumption and investments, and by sacrificing some current consumption and diverting resources into investment, the government is achieving economic growth. So the government is deciding basically should they produce more of capital or consumer goods. And the amount of, we say this, the amount of resources they choose to devote to investment, so how much of capital goods we buy, is basically depending on government's macroeconomic strategy. What is macroeconomic? When the government looks at the macroeconomic picture and say, hey, what is more important for us is probably putting more resources to capital goods or probably more resources consumer goods, depending on what the priority of the government is. So it could give priority to current consumption, or it could give priority to future consumption. Depending on that, government will decide what to produce. Make sense? So it could be more of capital goods or more of consumer goods. Okay, but there is an opportunity cost, as we can say. Right? Is there any question before we move on? Are we good to move on? Okay. Then the next question we need to look at is how to produce. When the government is thinking about how to produce, they're looking at a microeconomic level. From a micro level, when the government is basically looking at how to produce, they're deciding should we be more capital intensive or should we be more, labor intensive, right? And that decision basically will also be depending on basically government's plan, because the government is deciding what each industry and firm will produce and how they will produce it. So in this case, because the government is the owner of factors of production, they are the ones who will decide the key techniques that would be used. And of course, they will look at what the economy's resources are. If the economy has more of labor, they might go labor intensive. If the economy has more of capital, they might go capital intensive. But the decision is in the hand of government, which is basically looking at this according to what the resources are out there for them. Are we good? Does that make sense? Any questions, guys? Okay. Last is for whom to produce, and the answer is government is basically going to decide, should we make it, how do we basically distribute our output between consumers? Like, should we give it equally, or should we give it to those who have more needs? It could be giving it to more who has more needs, or those who are probably working hard. Like, so the government is deciding uh, uh, who to give the goods. They could give it equally. They could give it to, for example, more to needy, or they could give it to, for example, those who work hard. So depending on the government's sort of plan, it will decide who will get the good. Any question, guys? Does that make sense? Okay, great. Now, tomorrow, okay, let's copy this question, and tomorrow what we'll do is, once we get done to the pros and cons of command economy, we will try to answer this question. That's it. Thank you, guys.